Magellan, thank you so much for being here.
Oh, thank you for having me. It's great to talk to you today.
So, you've done remarkable things across your career, and today I'd love to learn more about the how for students and young professionals far and wide, particularly from a wellness perspective. So, I'd love to jump right in.
Okay, great.
So, you received your bachelor's degree in geology at the College of William and Mary, followed by your master's and PhD in geological sciences at Brown. What were you like as an undergrad and then as a grad student? And what did wellness mean to you then?
I will say, especially as an undergrad, I don't think I was terribly confident, and I was pretty intimidated. Like, I look at my own kids. So I've got grown-up kids. They're 34, 30, and 27. So my kids are very grown up. So I look at how they're so much more self-confident and will go off, semesters abroad, all kinds of stuff. I I didn't have that kind of confidence at that age. And and yet I, as a woman in science, where there were so few other women, felt really at home because of the support I got, especially at William and Mary as an undergrad. The professors were just, it was a small department. And, in retrospect, I went in there and, this 18-year-old walks into this department and is like, I'm going to be a geology major and I'm going to go work for NASA, and they're like, great, what can we do to help you? There was never like, you're a woman, you don't belong here. There was never like, what the heck are you talking about? They were just like, how are we going to help you get to where you want to go? And so that experience over 4 years of just having this incredibly supportive set of professors, um, I think gave me a basis later in my career and even in graduate school, where I felt much more challenged, much more insecure, much more like, what the heck am I doing here? Everybody's smarter than I am. And where I didn't get as much support, I had this little core, that William and Mary had given me that helped me to succeed. And at that point, people didn't talk about wellness as much. And yet I knew that for me to be healthy, I needed to put my work down. I needed to go for a walk. I needed to connect with nature. I needed to be outside. Those were the things that kind of brought me back to the stress level going down, kind of being able to manage. And for me, it's always been get outside. And now I very much see that through a wellness lens. At the time, I certainly didn't. It was just like, oh my God, I got to get outside and go take a walk in the woods for a while.
I love this. And I would suspect that the information we now have through so many channels of social media, both personal and professional, can really inform us now on what wellness means to each of us. But I think the fact that you were able to feel so grounded then and hold on to that is so special. So you graduate, and I'm curious about the things besides being brilliant that helped you become the deputy project scientist for the Magellan mission to Venus at JPL. That was the next line on your bio. And I'm curious about the jump between PhD student who, as you shared, had a slightly faced newer challenges compared to the undergraduate student. But then suddenly you're in this deputy project scientist role. Could you help fill in those spaces and share really what that felt like and how you stepped into those shoes?
I feel like I had this kind of golden path that helped make that happen. But by golden path, it just wasn't opportunities that opened up. It was people that helped me. Because when I got to JPL, after getting my PhD and got to work on the Magellan mission as a postdoc, I'm like, this is the most amazing thing. I can't believe I'm having this experience, but I'm going into these project meetings and it's kind of intimidating, the project manager, and then there's the project scientist, and then I'm his postdoc. So I'm like nobody, right? Nobody. And fairly early on, I saw some things. And I went to a guy named Charles Alachi, who later became the director of JPL. But at that point, he ran a division at JPL. And I was like, Charles, I see these things that are going wrong. And I was very proud of myself that I had identified these things that were going wrong. I'm like, I'm so cool. I could go identify problems. And he looked at me and goes, okay, what are you going to do? And I'm like, I'm like a postdoc. And he's like, don't bring me problems, bring me solutions. And I realized that in a lot of cases, you've got two groups of people, and one of the groups is saying, I want solution X. And you've got another group that's saying, I want solution Y. But they're not really talking to each other. And when you sitting, from a different vantage point, you can say, wow, there's actually a solution that's somewhere in the middle where both sides win. They don't win everything, but they both win something. And so I just realized if I was the solution person, and so that's what I started doing. And the next thing I knew, I was deputy project scientist because I did that a couple of times where I'm like, hey, here's a middle path. It wouldn't have happened if it weren't for Charles. And I will say, will also not have happened if it weren't for the project manager of Magellan, a guy named, at the time, a guy whose name is Tony Spear. And Tony was the kind of project manager that, of course, every project has a hierarchy, with managers and deputy managers and area heads. Tony wanted to hear everybody's best ideas. He didn't care if you were a postdoc. He probably wouldn't have cared if you were the janitor who was just in the room emptying a trash can. If you had a good idea, he wanted to hear it. And he ran this very flat organization. And so I learned if I spoke up with a solution, Tony was going to listen. And so that's what I mean by golden path, because there are lots of projects that I've run across in my career. Well, that's absolutely, you don't speak unless you're spoken to. And junior people, you sit against the wall and you never speak. And how dare, that are very, very hierarchical. Magellan wasn't like that. And so between Tony and Charles, I just felt like it helped me accelerate because I got great advice. And then I had someone who would actually listen to this ridiculous postdoc and say, wow, she's got a couple ideas we think are okay.
Wow, but it was also on you to make sure you articulated those solutions or even saw the problems. And I think this piece of advice goes such a long way to take a step back and to give yourself permission to see beyond just having your head down and doing the work, to allow yourself to even articulate that, even if it gets shot down once, to be the sort of person that would. I'm definitely going to replay what you just said and use that to fuel me. So
yeah, and I think that was it, because then you get more confidence, right? Because then you're like, oh, these people think I do have good ideas. So then when you have the next idea and you think, all right, I'm seeing something, but what would a solution look like? Can I go talk to people? Can I think about how to move this forward? It just builds, and then you gain more confidence. And again, I had that little warm core that I got from the folks at William and Mary who had confidence in me to succeed. And then you start, I've had another friend who's a woman, who's a very successful woman, say, I pretended until I became that person. So you kind of pretend to be more brave and more confident and more assertive than you actually are. And then you pretend so much that you are eventually that person.
Wow. So you put all of this into action and you become JPL's chief scientist for the New Millennium Project. What did effective leadership mean to you as a student, and how did this translate to your new role? Did you look at the incredible leaders around you then who helped you speak up as guidance? What did this look like?
To me, it was always like watching and learning and knowing how to be a good member of a team. Because again, coming out of NASA, which is so team focused, everybody's coming to the table with amazing skills and all different skills. And so the first thing you need to do is is listen and really respect other people, because chances are they're saying something really smart and really important. And so I think as a leader, understanding that your job isn't to go in there and tell people what to do. Your job is to listen to everybody's great ideas and find a path forward with them. And I think, to me, watching the project scientist of Magellan, a guy named Steve Saunders, who he was a really quiet guy. And a lot of the times he would just sit there and I would think, why isn't he like leaning forward and saying this and doing this and blah, blah, blah. And then quietly, he would get everybody to do the right thing. He just had a very different style. And it wasn't a style of like running forward and bashing people's heads together. It was quietly listening, figuring out a good course that made everyone a winner, and then moving that forward. And so I really learned from that, because then you're like, oh, leadership isn't shouting at people or telling people they're wrong, they need to agree with you. Leadership is listening and finding these compromise solutions that really move things forward. So to me, as I kept watching these leaders around me, I thought, the most important thing you can do is make sure you build a great team, because it's not about you, it's about the team. And then how do you really listen? And then how do you really talk to people to say, here's what we're doing. It may not agree with what you originally told me, but here's how my solution fits with your concerns, so that they know they've been listened to. Because a lot of times people are like, all right, I get you don't agree with me. I just want to know you heard me. And so that's kind of, how I always approached it.
Wow, that is so incredible. And I definitely, hearing that sort of style is really validating, because that's definitely the style that I would love to emulate in the future. And the fact that not only was it so successful, but that it resonated with you and that you took something away from that and were able to further emulate that in your career is really inspiring to me, and just a nudge that it is absolutely possible and you don't need to be screaming and shouting. So after GPL, you became VP and chief scientist at Proximity Research. What did you learn about taking care of yourself and wellness here in this new position? Really cool title. What did you learn here? Was it still taking those walks and just connecting with nature?
Well, even more at that point, because at that point, my husband had a really busy career. I had a really busy career, and we had 2 children, and then we had our third. And he got the opportunity to go over to London and work in the London office of the investment firm that he worked at. And at that point, all of a sudden, I had 2, about to be 3 little kids. And I just thought something has to give. He traveled all the time, and I was traveling a lot, and it just wasn't working. And I had a really good colleague who worked at University College of London. And I said, can I come work in your office at the university and just have a desk in a corner and get out of all these leadership positions and really focus on doing science? And so between my work at Proximity and working at University College London, I worked part-time. I worked kind of 20 to 30 hours a week and spent a lot of time with my kids when they were little. And I tried to go to every conference, and I tried to, like if people would ask me to be on a panel or a review panel, I stayed on the NASA missions I was on. But I just took kind of a half step back, which is so lucky, because so many women are in careers that you can't take a half step back or a quarter step back. I took kind of a quarter step back, maybe. You just can't. That's not a choice. But for me, I thought, well, I'm going to walk away from these leadership positions at JPL and kind of working my way up through the hierarchy of JPL and NASA. And I really want to focus on my kids, because trying to be a really good scientist, a good wife, and a good mother, it just was not working. And I was that unhealthy ball of stress. And what was really meaningful to me is the moment I stepped back and started working part-time and got off most of my leadership positions, my kids like got calmer. And it was lucky for me because, again, I could keep writing papers, I could keep going to conferences. I didn't give up working. I just kind of stopped working 50 hours a week and went to like 30 hours a week or 25 hours a week. And I did that for about 10 years. And I thought that was a super conscious decision to say, I'm not going to lead things. I'm not going to rise up through the ranks. I'm not going to have any big titles. Because I've made this compromise of saying I'm going to, go part-time, because for my own mental health, for my kids' mental health and everything else, I just felt like I couldn't do it all. But even at the time, I felt so lucky to be, I still have a career I can keep going. It wasn't like I had to say I'm walking away from being a planetary geologist, but it was interesting because if you had asked me at that time, do you think someday you're going to be chief scientist of NASA? I would have just been like, you've got to be kidding. I mean, because I sort of thought, all right, I've made a conscious decision not to go after things like that.
Wow. And I didn't realize that that was your quarter step back, because in reading your story, I thought that was the coolest step forward. And that I was like, and now she's in London? That's crazy. Wow. Okay. And what I take away from that is knowing how you can wait for that inspiration and knowledge to even reach out to a friend to hit you, so that you can create this career by design, and that you can show up in the fullness of who you are in those 10 years and take care of yourself. And that is what this podcast is about, to gather these stories, to learn the how. And there's so many ways in which people feel inspired, where they can process to think clearly, to even make that phone call. But that's what I want to hone in on here, because I'm sure that led to a series of events that helped you then brainstorm that move, and then that really like fascinating situation of teaching and working in a way that felt good and comfortable. And that's also it sounds like such a gift, because right before the pandemic, it felt as if everything was really revving up for folks. And then a lot of women around the world globally, they had to drop all the plates. And so right. I think hearing this and just knowing how to put some of those pieces together, and that it can be done, that part of your story is such a gift. So thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that affected me a huge amount at the time, and I would get so depressed and so stressed out about it. So that's always one of the main things when I talk to young women. I'm like, don't beat yourself up. Don't think this is where I should be, or this is, I'm not good enough, or I'm not doing a good job. I mean, my adult children now tease me about, because at the time I just thought, I'm not doing well. My kids are all fine. They've turned out really well. I didn't ruin them, but at the time I just had this idea that your career was something where you got one job, and then you got the next job, and then you got the next better job, and the better job, and the better job. And at the very peak, you retired, and life's just not like that. And so when I realized, the first time where I said, okay, I'm on this upward, if you want to call, increasing leadership positions an upward path, it's a path. And then I step back from it. I'm like, that wasn't what was supposed to happen. Like, I was always supposed to get the next job that I loved even more than the previous job. And at times I would look back and say, wow, that experience on Magellan was the best job I had. And is my career going to be one where I'm looking backwards, not looking forwards? And struggling through those moments was really tough, and luckily I had a super supportive husband. And I have great kids. And so you just said, this is the path I chose. But then the older I got, I realized, every decision you make, every experience you have teaches you something. And so by the time I went to interview to be chief scientist of NASA, I'd done a little bit of this, I'd done a little bit of that, but all of a sudden I had this resume that actually made me really well suited for that job. And so the other thing I always talk to people about is don't turn down opportunities that don't seem, that's not my linear path. Because linear paths don't really happen. And I think people think they happen more than they actually do.
Wow, yeah, absolutely. And so you get to build this resume and now you're interviewing for this dream role. The version of you that was a PhD student is finally like in the brink of getting this position, and then you make the position. Can you tell me about what you learned from some of the unique challenges here? You've been working your whole career to be here. You're finally there. What was challenging? What did you expect? And what did you take away from those challenges?
Um, you know, I think, the challenges at every job to me are often quite similar when it boils down to it. You try to identify like what are the most important things I can be working on? Where do my skill sets help to solve a problem? How do I find really smart people out there and go work with them? And then increasingly for me, as I was in these leadership positions, how do I help nurture the really great people that I'm meeting along the way in their careers to help them get to that next point where they're doing something that is really challenging and really interesting. And so to me, especially my time at NASA headquarters, I had the best boss in the world. Charlie Bolden was absolutely, he's just, he's an inspirational leader. He's an inspirational person. And to me, just following him around, trying to like hoover up every wonderful thing he would do to try to learn. Like, how can I learn to be a better person by watching Charlie's style of leadership, which I would argue, and for this is this very empathetic style of leadership. He wants to know what are the people around him, not just thinking, what are they feeling? Are they happy? Are they challenged? Are they on board with the mission? Do they understand how grateful he is that you're there and you're working hard? And so making sure, and when that time at NASA, when Charlie was the administrator, it didn't matter what role you were in. Charlie was going to make sure that you knew that you were critical to everything the agency did. And that I just learned so much from that.
Wow, that is so incredible. And I listen to a lot of Brene Brown podcasts. And so it's so wonderful to hear the power of gratitude and all of those, just articulating all of those feelings in real time at these levels. It is really bridging my love for space and the wellness and the leadership learnings all together. So thank you so much for that story. That is so fascinating. So,
I mean, even to this day, because I ran Air and Space, the Air and Space Museum for a while, and then I was just at Air and Space late last week, and seeing the members of my team there, it didn't matter whether they'd been a curator when I was there or part of the advancement department or one of the security guards at the front. Man, they were all getting the biggest hugs because they were each really critical members of the team doing really different things, but all really contributing to the success of the organization. And to me, as a leader, you not just have to understand that there aren't important people and unimportant people in your organization. Everyone is important. And then how do you make sure that they know how much you value them?
wow, yeah, absolutely. And so beyond this NASA role, you then take on the job of informing and inspiring millions of people each year, first as the director of the Air and Space Museum, and now as undersecretary, where you manage all of the science and research activities at the institution. You told me a little bit about your dream job as a graduate student. What does your career so far mean to younger you in surpassing even what you held on to as a dream then, and now in 2 posts beyond that? What has all of this meant to younger Ellen?
You know, what it means is to me, and this is going to sound like regretful, but it's not, because younger Ellen never imagined me in this role. I mean, I was a summer intern at the Air and Space Museum, and after my sophomore year of college, and I've had so many people say to me, "Oh, then you must have dreamed of leading the museum one day." No, because then everybody in leadership of the museum didn't look like me. And this issue to me, where part of the reason I didn't imagine these things for myself as younger me is because I didn't see anybody who looked like me in those roles. So it's so important to me now, and this is one of the reasons I went to the Air and Space Museum, and I love the Smithsonian so much, because we have the opportunity through every museum that we have, but especially for the museum we're going to be building, the Smithsonian American Women's History Museum, we have the ability to say, women have been out there doing amazing things and continue to do amazing things. And increasingly, they're in positions of leadership, and making that visible so that the younger me now says, well, she was head of the Air and Space Museum. I want to be head of the Air and Space Museum. I want to be vice president of the United States, because someone who looks like me is in that job. So I can do that too. And so that's probably one of the things I think about the most. And then I want to shake younger me and say, be more self-confident. You're going to do cool stuff, because I really wasn't. It just, it's funny to look back and say, what was I so worried about? But at that age, you're just very like, am I going to succeed? Am I not? Am I good at this? Am I not? And I had a lot of self-doubt, and now wanting younger me to not be so stressed out.
Wow. And it's definitely something that I do anytime I'm in DC. It's why I love DC, to feel inspired by the people who've gone before us. That's why I have this podcast. It's sharing these stories on a much smaller scale than the museums, but it's the same concept. And what you shared is so inspiring to me to continue sharing these conversations, asking these questions. And I'm in DC in 2 weeks, and I'm so excited to go and to just step into those halls, to feel inspired again. And thank you so much for all your work, and just for shining a light on all of these incredible people who have come before us, who are sometimes hidden figures, and to make them not hidden and in fact celebrated. So thank you for all of this. I had a couple final questions to close. You addressed the World Economic Forum's Council on the Future of Space Technologies at Davos, and you continue to serve on the council. You being there is definitely a vision board moment for me, because it's a vision that I have for myself, because I read it in your bio. Can you paint a picture of what being there felt like, so that the vision feels a little bit more real?
It's definitely like a huge moment of imposter syndrome, because you're just walking down this hallway. There's every major head of companies, government figures, going to hear, at the time, Vice President Biden speak, going to hear the head of China speak, the head of France speak, all these world leaders, and you're there in the room. And again, that's where I was really pinching younger me, going, you don't believe the things that you're going to be able to do, is to go. And the World Economic Forum is such a unique organization, because it really does bring together the public sector, governments, private sector, companies, nonprofits, academia, to really talk about the biggest challenges of our time, things like climate change, refugees, immigration, how we're going to feed the world, how we're going to cope with rising sea levels and growing inequality. And so to be there in the rooms when people are having these really deep conversations, and then you go out and walk down the hallway and Yo-Yo Ma is sitting there playing his cello, and you're just like, it's It's surreal. So, and then you go outside and it's freezing cold and there's ice all over the sidewalks and you're worried you're going to fall down. So, and inside you have to wear high heels. So that's a whole separate issue. But, it's an amazing event. It's something that a lot of people just say, oh, what really goes on there? But I would say at the working level, there's a lot of people from multiple sectors trying to figure out how do we make the world a better place. And I found it just really inspiring and couldn't believe I was actually part of it.
Wow, thank you. And I'm gonna think of the coldness of the ice, the heels, the music, and I'm so grateful for that story. I have one last question to close out the podcast. What does wellness and effective leadership mean to you today, present day?
I think it always mattered to me, but then coming out of the pandemic, I think it's something I've thought very deeply about over the last 3 years, because when you have a team, when the pandemic started, I was at the Air and Space Museum. And so when you have a team that's this incredibly functioning, high functioning team, and we run a museum, we do research, we do lots of things, but fundamentally we run a museum to inspire the next generation of explorers and innovators. And now that's shut, and now that team is at home. And so how do you keep the work going, but keep people inspired and really understand what kind of personal stress they're going through, their families, their children, their parents? I think none of us came through the pandemic without stories of loss, without stories of isolation. And so having to balance between how do I get the work done with how do I keep my people healthy, and on an even keel, and that second part is just as important as the first part. And so my hope is that coming through that experience, it's made us all more empathetic leaders. It's made us all think more about wellness, because fundamentally, if my team isn't in a good place mentally, we're not going to get the work done that we need to get done. And so how do I, as a leader, think about that? And to me, the pandemic just really brought home how important that was. And I've been lucky again. Secretary Lonnie Bunch at the Smithsonian is an amazing leader of people who so cares about everybody who works at the Smithsonian. Charlie was the same way about NASA. And so I've been really lucky to have two bosses who are incredible role models that I can always watch and learn from.
That is so incredible and the absolute dream. And it's been such a privilege to speak to you. I'm so grateful for all your stories and to color in everything that you've experienced from the wellness lens and to get all your leadership tidbits. So thank you so much for your time. I was wondering if there was anything else that maybe you wanted to touch on more, or any other closing thoughts that you may have.
No, just thank you for really doing this, because I do think it's really important, and wellness is such an important issue that I think, again, you're not going to reach the heights in your career unless you really pay attention to that wellness portion.
Well, I couldn't agree more, and I love that it's coming from you. So thank you so much, Ellen.
Thank you.